If you are still counting on me to be impressed by a man who cannot even pay his own way, then you are living in a fantasy." Rebecca Lane said it with a small, sharp smile, standing by the kitchen counter with her arms folded and her head tilted just enough to make the insult feel deliberate. Michael Bennett did not move right away. I just stood there in the middle of our living room, the morning light coming in through the blinds and cutting pale lines across the floor, while the coffee in my hand went cold and the room around us seemed to shrink with every word she chose. Rebecca had that look again, the one she wore whenever she wanted me to feel like the last person in the room who still did not understand what was happening. She glanced at her phone, then at the envelope on the table, then back at me, as if she were waiting for me to react the way I used to. But I had already learned that reacting too quickly only gave her more to work with. So I stayed quiet, listening to the sound of the refrigerator hum, the faint ticking of the wall clock, and the distant noise of a truck rolling past outside on the street. It all felt ordinary, almost too ordinary, for a conversation that was about to change the shape of my life. Rebecca sighed, as if she were tired of waiting for me to catch up. She had been making little comments like this for months, never loud enough to seem dramatic, but sharp enough to cut in small, private places. When we went out to dinner, she started choosing the expensive places and then acting surprised when I looked at the check. When friends came over, she laughed a little too long at jokes about men who did not know how to provide. When her sister called, she would lower her voice and talk about how some people stayed stuck in the same place because they were too afraid to do better. Every time, she said it like she was talking about somebody else, but the message always landed on me. I had spent years building a life she once called simple and stable, years working early mornings and late nights, years believing that quiet effort meant something. But lately, Rebecca spoke about effort like it was an excuse people made when they had nothing better to offer. She had begun dressing differently too, more polished, more careful, like she was preparing for a life that no longer included the man standing in front of her. I set the coffee down slowly and looked at the envelope again. She noticed. Of course she noticed. Rebecca always noticed the things she thought mattered. What she never noticed was how still I had become around her, how much I had stopped explaining myself, how often I had begun to watch instead of argue. She thought my silence was confusion. It was not. It was memory. It was the part of me that had started keeping track of every small change, every late reply, every conversation that ended too quickly, every time she made me feel like I should be grateful for being allowed to stay in my own marriage. Rebecca stepped closer and let out a dry laugh that did not reach her eyes. "We both know this is not working," she said, the words landing in the room like something already decided. "You do not have the kind of future I need, Michael. I am tired of pretending otherwise." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw how calmly she was preparing to walk away from a life she had once asked me to build with her. The sadness did not hit me all at once. It came in pieces, in the space between her breaths, in the way she would not meet my eyes for more than a second, in the easy confidence of someone who believed she had already won. I took one slow breath, then another, and let the silence hold the room for a little longer. Rebecca thought she had just delivered the final word. What she did not know was that the final word had not been spoken yet, and when it came, it would change everything she thought she understood about me. Rebecca Lane stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment longer, watching me as if she expected the room to finally break open the way she had been trying to make it for months. But I did not give her that. I stayed where I was, my hand resting on the back of a chair, my coffee untouched now, and let the silence settle between us in a way that made her shift her weight and look away first. The morning felt strangely clear, with pale lights spilling across the counters, the faint buzz of the refrigerator filling the spaces where neither of us seemed willing to speak first, and the clock above the stove marking each second with an almost insulting steadiness. Rebecca hated when I did this, when I refused to give her the reaction she had already decided I should have. She had been pushing me toward this edge for weeks, maybe longer, always with the same careful tone that made every criticism sound practical, every insult sound like concern, and every distance she created feel like it had somehow happened to both of us at once. I had noticed the small things before I had noticed the big ones. The way she checked her phone before she said good morning. The way she came home later on Fridays and smiled too quickly when I asked where she had been. The way she began speaking about her future with a little more certainty and about ours with a little less. At first I told myself it was stress, then work, then one of those seasons people go through when life feels heavier than it should. But seasons end, and the pattern stayed. Rebecca had become careful in the way people get careful when they are preparing to leave something behind. She would straighten her sleeves before speaking, then touch the edge of the counter, as if keeping herself anchored. She had always been good at looking composed when she wanted to be believed. That was part of what had made this so difficult to ignore. She did not shout. She did not need to. Her words had learned how to sit quietly and still do damage. So I began to do the same. I stopped arguing with every small jab. I stopped chasing answers that never came clean. I started paying attention instead to what was not being said, to the pauses, to the lies that came dressed as inconvenience, to the way her attention slipped elsewhere whenever the conversation touched anything that felt real. That was the difference between us now. She thought I was getting slower, easier to manage, less likely to fight back. In truth, I was becoming harder to mislead because I was no longer listening only to what she said. I was watching the space around her words. Rebecca crossed her arms and let out a shallow breath, the kind that said she was trying to remain in control. "You do not have to make this harder than it already is," she said, glancing toward the envelope on the table without touching it. I almost smiled at that. Harder for whom, I wondered. For the man being told his future was no longer wanted, or for the woman who had already decided to leave long before she bothered saying it out loud. I did not answer right away. Instead, I looked at the envelope and thought about how much time I had spent pretending not to see what had been building in front of me. Every late night, every strange weekend plan, every conversation that ended with her telling me I was imagining things. I had let her believe that silence meant confusion, when in fact silence had been the place where I was collecting the truth. Rebecca finally looked at me again, her expression sharpening when she realized I was not about to beg, not about to plead, not about to perform the kind of panic she seemed to need from me. I set my coffee aside, folded my hands, and spoke evenly. "If this is the direction you want to take, then we should be honest about the reasons behind it." Her eyes narrowed just a little, because I had chosen words she could not easily dismiss. She had expected frustration. She had expected resistance. What she did not expect was calm. And that calm, more than anything else, began to unsettle her, because now the conversation no longer belonged to the person who had been pushing it toward an ending. It belonged to the one who had finally started paying attention. Rebecca Lane did not respond right away, and the silence that followed felt different from the one before. This one was heavier, more uncertain, as if she had expected me to chase after her words and instead found me standing still, calm enough to make her rethink the direction she had already chosen. She glanced toward the hallway, then back at me, then finally toward the envelope on the table, as though it might explain something she was not ready to say out loud. I stayed where I was, hands folded, shoulders relaxed, watching the small changes in her face the way a man watches weather coming over the horizon. The kitchen still smelled like coffee and toast, the same ordinary morning smells that had once made this room feel warm and familiar, but now every detail seemed sharpened by what neither of us was saying. Rebecca shifted her stance and pressed her lips together. The confidence that had carried her into the conversation was still there, but only in pieces now, not whole. I had seen enough to know that kind of posture. It was the posture of someone trying to keep a door closed while realizing it might already be opening. For months, I had watched her move through the house with a little too much caution, every weekend arranged with a little too much precision, every answer to my questions wrapped in just enough polish to sound harmless. At first I wanted to believe her. Then I wanted to believe I was mistaken. But patterns have a way of becoming louder when you stop pretending they are random. Rebecca had started leaving with the same kind of smooth excuse every Saturday, usually with her phone already in her hand and her keys in the other, telling me she needed space, fresh air, time with people who understood her. I had asked once where she was going. She told me I was acting suspicious. I asked again the next week. She told me I was making problems where there were none. After that, I stopped asking so directly, not because I trusted her, but because I wanted to see what happened when she thought the questions were gone. That was when I started noticing the details she did not think mattered. The extra time in the bathroom, the different perfume, the new clothes that were always a little too intentional for a casual outing. The way she came back from those Saturdays with an expression that looked satisfied in a way I had not seen in a long time. Rebecca thought I was slow to catch up. She thought I had let the marriage become a habit I would not question. What she did not understand was that the quiet in me had changed. I was no longer trying to fill every gap in her story with hope. I was collecting the shape of the gaps themselves. She rubbed one thumb against the side of her wrist and spoke with the careful tone she used when she wanted a sentence to sound final. "You keep looking at me like I have done something wrong," she said. "I am trying to be honest about what I want." I nodded once, not out of agreement, but because I had finally reached the point where her version of honesty no longer sounded complete. I glanced at the envelope again, then back at her, and asked the question I had been holding back for too long. "Then be honest about all of it," I said quietly. "Tell me why every weekend has started to look the same, and why your answers always sound rehearsed." Rebecca flinched just enough for me to notice. It was small, almost nothing, but it confirmed what I had already begun to feel. She had not expected me to ask that way, with no anger, no raised voice, no pleading. She had expected frustration she could redirect, emotion she could manage. Instead, she was getting precision, and precision was harder to dismiss. The room remained still while she looked at me, her expression tightening with the first signs of unease, because now she understood something she had not wanted to see before. I was not lost in the conversation anymore. I was listening differently, and that meant the truth was getting closer. Rebecca Lane pressed her lips together and finally stepped back from the counter, her gaze flicking to the envelope on the table as if it were a puzzle she had not yet figured out. Evan Collins did not move immediately, letting her take that first moment of hesitation while the late morning light stretched across the living room, painting soft stripes on the hardwood floor. The air was still, almost too quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant car passing by on the street. Rebecca's posture had changed subtly, shoulders tightening, hands brushing against her thighs as she realized that the conversation had already shifted to a place she had not intended. Evan remained calm, upright, hands loosely resting at his sides, his expression unreadable but his presence commanding, letting the silence act as a weight that pressed her to acknowledge what she had been avoiding for months. The envelope itself seemed unassuming, yet it contained months of quiet preparation, documents and notes that traced a path she had never suspected. Rebecca's eyes flicked to him again, searching for a reaction, a clue, some sign of weakness or uncertainty that she could exploit, but Evan offered none. He did not need to. The truth had been carefully organized, allowed to sit in the room like a witness, and that was enough to begin dismantling the confidence she had relied on. For weeks, Evan had noticed the subtle patterns in her behavior. The weekend she left early with small excuses, the way she smiled too quickly when explaining where she had been, the changed tone in her voice whenever she mentioned her friends or past acquaintances. He had cataloged it silently, recording nothing in writing, only in his memory, and now the quiet accumulation of facts was speaking louder than any argument she could make. Rebecca shifted again, glancing at the envelope before opening it, her movements slow, deliberate, like she was trying to brace herself for what she would find inside. Evan's eyes followed every subtle gesture, noting the tightening of her jaw, the blink that lasted longer than usual, the tiny inhale as she realized that this was more than she had prepared for. The living room felt smaller as the impact of the revelation began to fill the space, the walls seeming to draw closer with the weight of anticipation and reflection. The subtle lighting, the ordinary sounds, the familiar furniture, all of it became the backdrop for a moment that was extraordinary not in spectacle, but in its quiet inevitability. Rebecca's hands hovered over the envelope for a moment before touching the papers inside, and in that instant, Evan knew that the shift had begun. She understood now, just enough to feel the first sting of recognition that she had misjudged him entirely. Every step she had taken to assert control, every slight to his character, every assumed advantage had been anticipated, cataloged, and held in reserve for exactly this moment. Evan did not need to speak. The calm in his demeanor, the precision of his observation, the patience that had guided him all these months, was enough to communicate that the balance in the room had quietly, decisively changed. Rebecca Lane, who had entered the morning confident and dismissive, now sat with the realization that the story she thought she controlled had already been rewritten, and the author had been quietly present all along. Rebecca Lane finally picked up the envelope, her fingers brushing over the papers inside, as if each one held a secret she was not yet ready to face. While Evan Collins remained calm in the center of the room, watching her with a steady gaze that did not waver for a single moment. The sunlight had shifted lower, casting warmer tones across the hardwood floors and reflecting softly off the kitchen counters, highlighting the subtle tension in the room. Rebecca's movements were careful now, deliberate, almost hesitant, as she sorted through the documents, realizing slowly that they told a story she had never imagined. Evan did not speak. He had learned long ago that silence could convey more than any argument, and he let it stretch, letting the weight of accumulated truth fill the space between them. The air was still except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside, but each ordinary noise now seemed amplified, emphasizing every small reaction from Rebecca as she read through each detail, each note, each record of months. He had quietly observed her behavior and prepared for this moment. She paused over a single page, and Evan noted the slight tightening of her jaw, the subtle inhale that betrayed the first stirrings of recognition that she had underestimated him. Every gesture she made seemed charged with the dawning realization that the version of events she had believed in all this time was incomplete, that the assumptions she had made about his life, his resources, and his patience were entirely mistaken. Her friends, who had been lingering quietly nearby, shifted slightly, sensing that the balance in the room had changed, that the quiet man in the center of the room was no longer merely reacting but quietly in command of the situation. Evan had allowed the small things to accumulate unnoticed until the moment when they could no longer be ignored, and the envelope on the table represented the culmination of that patience, a careful assembly of evidence that now stood undeniable before her. Rebecca's eyes moved from the papers to Evan and back again, scanning for some sign of weakness, some crack in his demeanor she could exploit, but he offered none. His calm and measured presence contrasted sharply with her growing unease, showing her that control had quietly shifted. She pressed her lips together and exhaled softly, realizing that she could no longer dismiss the quiet strength that had been building in him over time. Each second that passed seemed to reinforce the truth that Evan had anticipated every move she had made, observed every hesitation, and cataloged every instance where she had underestimated him. The living room, filled with familiar objects, now felt like a stage for a revelation that had been carefully choreographed through months of observation. Rebecca's hands lingered on the envelope for a long moment before she set it down with care, her expression a mixture of disbelief and reluctant understanding, as Evan remained perfectly still, letting the silence do its work, letting the unspoken truth demonstrate itself fully without the need for words, because the quiet patience and observation he had maintained over all these months were now evident in every detail. And she could not escape the realization that the person she had underestimated was the one who had quietly controlled the narrative all along. The afternoon light in the living room had softened, filtering through the blinds and stretching warm stripes across the floor as Evan Collins watched Rebecca Lane carefully, noting each subtle shift in her posture and expression. She sat at the table, papers splayed out before her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, as if the room itself held its breath. Evan remained calm, upright, hands resting loosely, letting the silence grow heavy enough for Rebecca to feel it pressing against her chest. Each small sound, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic outside, the ticking of the clock, was amplified in the quiet, emphasizing every glance, every hesitation. Rebecca shifted in her seat, tugging at the edge of the envelope as though it were an anchor to steady herself, but Evan had already noticed the subtle tremor in her hands, the barely perceptible tightening of her jaw. He had spent weeks observing patterns, quietly noting the weekends she disappeared without clear explanation, the hurried phone calls, the evasive answers, and the small inconsistencies that previously seemed trivial. Now, each of those details had been gathered and laid before her, structured in a way that left no room for denial. Evan's calmness was deliberate. He did not need to raise his voice, to gesture, to insist. The information on the table spoke for itself. Every line, every fact, every careful record, he had kept constructing the undeniable narrative. Rebecca's eyes darted from one page to another, then back to him, searching for a flaw, a hint of weakness she could exploit, but there was none. The quiet command in his posture, the patience he had maintained, and the unwavering attention to her reactions had already shifted the balance in the room. The living room, filled with familiar objects, the couch, the coffee table, the framed photographs, now felt like the stage for a revelation she had not anticipated. Each second stretched, reinforcing the reality that Evan had been silently in control, that every movement, every pause, every calculated omission had been part of his preparation. Rebecca exhaled softly, a sound that was almost imperceptible but full of the tension she had been holding back, realizing slowly that the man she had underestimated was not only aware but had anticipated her every expectation and doubt. Her friends, who had been lingering at the edges, now shifted uneasily, sensing that the quiet strength in Evan could not be contested by argument or appeal. Evan watched the subtle interplay of recognition and unease unfold, letting the moment exist fully, allowing Rebecca to confront the truth she had avoided. Her lips pressed together, her eyes narrowing in thought, as the full weight of the revelation began to settle, confirming that the balance of power had irrevocably changed. And as the sunlight continued to stream across the room, highlighting each small movement, Evan understood that the true measure of influence often lay not in confrontation, but in patient observation, in allowing the facts and timing to speak for themselves. And Rebecca Lane, who had come expecting to assert control, was slowly realizing she was no longer the one guiding the narrative. Evan Collins remained motionless in the center of the living room, his eyes tracking every subtle movement Rebecca Lane made as she continued to sift through the documents, her fingers brushing lightly over each page, her face a careful mix of disbelief and realization. The late afternoon sun had lowered, casting longer, warmer streaks across the hardwood floor and softening the edges of familiar furniture, turning the ordinary room into a space charged with quiet tension. Rebecca shifted slightly, her shoulders tightening as she absorbed the evidence before her, each detail building a narrative that she had refused to see until now. Evan did not speak. He had learned that silence often communicates more than words, and he let it stretch, allowing the quiet weight of accumulated facts to settle fully in the room. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional distant car, and the ticking clock became markers of a slow, deliberate rhythm that emphasized each flicker of emotion across her features. He had watched patterns form for months, weekends that seemed carefully scheduled away from him, quick glances at her phone, subtle changes in her tone and expressions, all small signs that had previously seemed insignificant but now formed a clear story. Each movement of Rebecca's hands, the slight inhale she could not hide, the subtle exhale that followed, all signaled that the first cracks of understanding were appearing, that the quiet patience Evan had maintained was starting to take effect. He noted every blink, every slight hesitation, and allowed the silence to give those observations weight. Rebecca's eyes flicked from the documents to Evan and back again, seeking something she might control, some misstep to exploit, but Evan offered nothing. His composed presence, the unwavering steadiness of his posture, the measured calm in his expression all reinforced that the balance of power in the room had shifted decisively. The familiar room, once ordinary, now felt transformed by the awareness of both past patterns and the evidence laid before her. Each second stretched, highlighting the contrast between expectation and reality, between the woman who thought she had been in control and the man who had quietly anticipated every step. Evan's calm allowed the documents to speak louder than any argument, each fact in sequence revealing a patience and understanding that had gone unnoticed, an insight that Rebecca had never accounted for. She set the envelope down slowly, her fingers lingering, realizing that the control she thought she wielded was no longer in her hands. The quiet strength in Evan, cultivated over months of observation, had become a tangible presence, reshaping the room and the dynamic entirely. Rebecca Lane, who had arrived confident and dismissive, now found herself confronted with a reality she could not deny. A man who had quietly held the narrative, turning patience into power, and making her reevaluate every assumption she had held about him and the life she thought she understood. The sunlight had softened into a golden hue as Evan Collins continued to watch Rebecca Lane, who now sat quietly, Papers spread out across the table, each sheet a small revelation that shifted the room's energy subtly but unmistakably. Her eyes moved rapidly from document to document, glancing at him occasionally as if to confirm that the reality before her was true, and Evan's calm presence amplified the weight of what she was discovering. Every detail, every note he had silently gathered over months of observation, had been arranged to reveal the truth in a way that required no explanation, no pleading, and no confrontation. Only the patient accumulation of fact and observation. The air in the room seemed to hold still around them, filled only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant street noises that normally would have gone unnoticed, yet now seemed to underscore the intensity of the moment. Rebecca's hands hovered over the envelope, touching the top edges of the papers almost hesitantly, realizing for the first time the magnitude of what had been quietly hidden in plain sight all along. Evan did not speak. He did not need to. His calm, steady demeanor, the deliberate way he allowed silence to dominate the room, made it impossible for her to maintain her earlier confidence. Each subtle movement she made, the tightening of her jaw, the small inhale, the slow exhale, revealed the dawning understanding that she had misjudged him entirely, that the balance of control she had assumed was gone, and that he had orchestrated a careful path leading to exactly this revelation. The living room, filled with familiar furniture and ordinary objects, now felt charged, almost theatrical in its quiet, as every small detail, the sunlight across the floor, the objects on the counter, the soft shadows along the walls, served to highlight the shift in power and perception. Rebecca finally set the envelope down with a small, almost imperceptible tremor, her expression a mix of disbelief, reluctant acceptance, and recognition that the man she had thought she understood completely had quietly guided every step toward this moment. Evan's eyes never left hers, his posture unchanged, his patience and observation evident in the stillness, demonstrating that true control had always been in his hands, revealed only when the timing was right. The weight of all those unspoken truths filled the room, pressing on the corners, emphasizing that every misjudgment, every assumption she had made, and every effort to assert dominance had been anticipated and accounted for, leaving Rebecca to absorb, finally, that the quiet man she had underestimated had quietly held command the entire time, and that the outcome had been carefully constructed long before she realized it. By the time the last page settled back into the envelope, the living room had become so quiet that even the smallest sound felt important. Evan Collins stood near the coffee table with the same steady calm he had carried from the beginning, while Rebecca Lane sat still in the chair across from him, her hands resting loosely over the papers as though she was no longer sure what to do with them. The afternoon light had turned warmer, then softer, fading slowly through the blinds and stretching long golden lines across the hardwood floor. For a while, neither of them spoke. There was no need to force the moment. The truth had already done what it came to do. Rebecca kept looking at the documents, then up at Evan, then back down again, as if she were hoping the page numbers might change if she stared long enough. They did not. Everything remained exactly as it was, carefully organized, quietly undeniable. Evan could see it in her face now, the way certainty had given way to something more fragile, something that looked much closer to fear than confidence. Not fear of a fight, fear of being understood too late. That was the part she had not expected. Not the envelope, not the records, not the patience it had taken to gather them. What she had not expected was the realization that he had been paying attention all along, long before she thought he was. Long before she started speaking to him like his questions were an inconvenience. Long before she began treating his silence like proof that he had nothing left to say. Evan had noticed the changes months ago. The rushed exits, the polished answers, the way every Saturday seemed to follow the same path, the same excuses, the same careful distance. At first he had hoped he was wrong. Then he had hoped there was a simple explanation. But hope had become something quieter over time, something he set aside when the facts no longer fit the story she had been telling. So he stopped arguing and started watching. That was the difference between them. She had believed the loudest person in the room controlled the story. Evan had learned that the person who paid attention the longest often controlled the ending. Rebecca finally closed the envelope and set it down with a small, unsteady motion. She looked at him with a face that had lost the sharpness it carried when the morning began. There was no easy comeback left now, no polished line to place back into the conversation. Only the difficult silence of someone who had just realized the ground beneath her assumptions was not as solid as she thought. Evan did not gloat. He did not need to. He simply reached for the envelope, slipped it into the folder, and stood there for one more breath, letting the room understand that the balance had changed for good. He turned toward the hallway, then paused at the edge of the room long enough for the silence to settle completely behind him. It was a quiet ending, but that was what made it powerful. No shouting, no drama, just the clean, final feeling of a man walking away from a version of life that had stopped respecting him. As he stepped toward the door, the last light of the afternoon caught the edge of his jacket and the polished floor beneath him, and the room behind him seemed to belong to someone else now. If you felt the weight of this story, think about what stayed with you most: the patience, the silence, or the moment the truth finally made itself impossible to ignore. And if stories like this are the kind you want to keep following, make sure you subscribe, because the next one may be even quieter before it turns even harder.